The sky was burning red above the alien city, and the sound of heavy drums echoed across the wide stone arena where thousands of creatures had gathered to watch the display of power and fear. For this was the place where rulers broke the spirit of slaves, and today it was the turn of one human who had been dragged from the dark cells beneath the ground, his body marked with bruises, his eyes still burning with a fire that refused to die, and the crowd leaned forward to see if the flame would be crushed or if it would try to rise against the impossible weight of the Empire. Arena was shaped like a giant circle carved into the bones of the earth, and above all sat the high throne where the alien queen waited, her form both terrifying and majestic, her body covered in dark scales that shone like steel under the blood-colored sun, and behind her stretched the long tail that every creature feared. For it was said that when the queen struck with her tail, armies fell, and when she wrapped it around her enemies, no one lived to tell the tale. And the crowd whispered as she stood, the silence heavy like a storm that was about to break. The human was pushed into the open space by guards taller than him and armed with spears that glowed with strange blue light. But he did not fall to his knees as most slaves did. Instead, he walked slowly to the center of the arena, his steps steady as if he carried no fear at all. And the aliens watching hissed in disbelief, for no human had ever walked so calmly before their queen, and their voices rose like a wave, but then quickly fell as the queen raised her claw for silence. She looked down upon him with eyes like burning coals, and her voice shook the ground as she spoke, calling him weak and fragile, calling his kind nothing more than animals fit only for chains and labor. But the human did not lower his head. His name was Alex, and though no one in the arena knew his story, they could all see the defiance in his stance, like a shadow that refused to break, even under the weight of a mountain. Queen stepped down from her throne, her long tail dragging behind her, the sound of its scales scratching against stone echoing across the arena, and the crowd shivered, for they knew what this meant. She did not often descend to face slaves herself, but when she did, it was always an act of cruelty, meant to remind the Empire of her power and dominance. And now every eye was fixed on the small fragile human who looked up at the monster that ruled them all. The air grew heavy as the queen circled him, her tail swaying with every step, her voice mocking him as she told him he would kneel before her and beg for mercy before the end. But Alex only clenched his fists, his heart pounding inside his chest, yet he refused to show weakness, because he knew that this was more than survival. It was a test of the spirit of every human that lived under chains, and he would not let them see him bow. The crowd waited, their breath caught between fear and curiosity, some of them hungry to see blood, others strangely drawn to the fire they saw in the eyes of the human. And whispers spread like smoke through the stands. Maybe this human was mad, maybe he did not know what death was, or maybe there was something more, something hidden that even the queen could not see. The drums began to beat again, slow, heavy, and endless, like the heartbeat of the Empire itself, and the queen raised her claws, shining like black blades, as she prepared to strike. But Alex did not move back. He only took one step closer, his eyes locked on hers, as if he could see past the fear and the hatred into something deeper. And the arena trembled with the weight of the moment. For the first time in memory, a human did not crawl or beg or scream in the arena. Instead, Alex stood in silence under the shadow of the queen, her massive tail coiling like a serpent, ready to crush him in an instant. And yet, he did not falter, and the silence, this defiance, hung in the air like lightning before a storm, making every creature present wonder what was about to happen, and why their hearts were racing with something they had never felt before. The queen stood taller now, her wings stretched wide as the crowd fell into silence, and the air itself seemed to stop moving, because all eyes were locked on the small, fragile figure of the human, who stood in the middle of the arena with nothing in his hands, no armor, no weapon, only the stubborn fire in his eyes, and the weight of 1,000 years of chains pressing down on his shoulders. And still he did not bow. The Queen walked in slow circles around him, her tail dragging across the stone floor, making a sound like a blade being sharpened for battle, and her mocking words cut into the silence. She told the human that he would die here before her throne, and his broken body would remind all creatures in the Empire that resistance was useless. She told him that his spirit would be crushed like glass beneath her claws, and that the crowd would laugh at his final scream. And yet, the human said nothing, because words would not protect him here, only action would. The crowd leaned forward from the stands, their alien faces twisted with hunger for violence, and with the cruel joy of seeing a slave destroyed. But there was something different in their eyes now, because they could not look away from the way this human stood, his body bruised and scarred, but still unshaken, and they wondered if perhaps there was something inside him, something unbreakable, that even the queen herself would find hard to destroy. The drums began again, slow and heavy, their sound echoing across the stone walls, as if the heart of the Empire itself was beating louder and louder, and the guards surrounding the arena slammed their spears into the ground, sending sparks of blue light into the air, and it felt as if the whole world was waiting for the moment when the human would finally fall. But then something unexpected happened, because as the queen passed behind him, Alex turned his head just enough to follow her with his eyes, and when her long tail swayed past him, he did not step back in fear. Instead, he moved forward faster than anyone thought a human could move, his hand shooting out to seize the tail of the queen, and his fingers wrapped around the scaled flesh with a grip so tight it made the crowd gasp in one single voice that shook the entire arena. The silence that followed was heavier than the drums, heavier than the roar of 1,000 battles, because no creature in the Empire, no slave, no soldier had ever dared to touch the tail of the queen, and yet here stood a human with his hand around it, holding her as if she was no more than flesh and blood, and not the living terror that ruled their lives. And the crowd froze as if time itself had stopped. The queen's head snapped around, her burning eyes wide with shock and rage, and for the first time, the mighty ruler who had never been touched by any living thing found herself trapped in a moment of humiliation and disbelief, and she roared, her voice shaking the stones beneath their feet, the sound rising like thunder into the bloody sky. But even as the roar echoed, Alex did not let go. He held on with all the strength in his body, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it would break through his chest, but his mind burning with only one thought, that he would not bow and he would not break. The guards started to move, rushing toward him, their spears raised ready to strike him down where he stood. But the queen raised her claw high into the air, stopping them, because this moment belonged to her, and only her, and her pride would not allow anyone else to interfere. And the guards froze, watching with fear and awe, because they too had never seen their queen's tail caught by anyone, much less a human. Crowd began to whisper, voices rising like a storm around the arena, some calling for his death, others stunned into silence, some staring in disbelief at the sight before them, because this was more than rebellion. This was sacrilege, and still the human did not let go, his eyes locked on the queen, as if he were daring her to strike him down. And in those eyes she saw something she had not seen before, something that unsettled her deep within her core. Claws extended, long black blades glinting in the red light, and she raised one high above her head, ready to bring it down upon him and end this insult with blood. And yet in that instant, there was a hesitation so small and so fleeting that only the closest in the crowd could see it, a flicker of doubt in her movement, as if the fire in his eyes had reached something she could not name, and her tail twitched under his grip, but still he refused to release it. The curtain silence stretched long and suffocating the air, heavy with suspense. The crowd frozen between fear and awe, the human trembling with the effort of holding on but unbroken, and the queen trembling not with weakness but with the first taste of something she had never known before, the taste of being challenged by a creature she had always thought beneath her, and that taste was bitter like ash in her mouth. Arena shook as the roar of the queen thundered across the blood-red sky, and the sound was so powerful that the creatures in the crowd covered their ears in fear yet. Even through that terrible sound, the human stood, his hand gripping her tail, his body trembling with effort, but his eyes never leaving hers, and the sight of this defiance burned into the minds of every soul who watched, because no one had ever dared to do what he had just done. The queen raised her claw, her long black blades gleaming like death itself, and the crowd waited for the strike that would split the human into pieces and stain the stone with his blood. But something strange held her back, because she had crushed warriors far stronger than him, and she had broken creatures far taller and sharper, yet, in this moment, she felt something new, a feeling she could not name, as his gaze locked onto hers, refusing to bow, refusing to surrender. The whispers in the stands began to grow louder, 1,000 voices carried by the wind, some hissing for her to end him quickly and prove her rule. Others stunned into silence, unable to believe that a fragile human had forced their queen to hesitate, and among them grew a dangerous thought. Perhaps the empire was not as unshakable as it had always seemed. Perhaps even the queen could bleed. Human spoke then, his voice rough and broken from pain, but strong enough to carry across the arena. He told her that humans were not weak, that they were not animals to be broken. He told her that though their bodies could be cut and burned, their spirit would not die, and every word he spoke carried the weight of chains and suffering, and yet also the fire of defiance. And his words moved through the crowd like sparks searching for dry wood. The queen snarled her wings, snapping open, her fury pouring into the air like fire, and she pulled against his grip, her tail thrashing with the strength of a storm, yet somehow he held on, his muscles burning his bones, screaming with pain, but his will refusing to release. And for the first time in her reign, the alien queen felt resistance from a creature she had thought beneath her, and that resistance cut deeper than any blade. The guards at the edge of the arena shifted nervously, their spears glowing with blue light, their orders clear to strike only if commanded. But they too felt the weight of this moment, and though they feared her wrath, they also could not take their eyes off the human who defied her in the heart of her empire. And in their silence, there was a small hidden crack in the wall of obedience that bound them. Queen struck then, her claw sweeping down with a force that could cut stone. But the human moved with desperate speed, throwing himself aside, just enough that the blade of her claw carved into the earth instead of his flesh, and dust and rock exploded into the air. But when it cleared, he was still standing, still gripping, her tail still staring into her burning eyes, and the gasps from the crowd shook the very sky. She roared again, slamming her wings against the ground, the sound like thunder rolling through the arena, and her fury twisted into something darker. Not just rage, but humiliation, because in front of her empire, in front of her throne, a human had dared to seize her tail and survive her strike, and the weight of that shame pressed against her like fire against her scales, and she swore in her heart that she would break him no matter what it cost. But even as she thought of breaking him, her mind flickered with confusion, because in his eyes, she did not see only defiance, she saw something deeper, a strength that was not born of claws or wings or scales, but of something invisible, something that had kept his kind alive even when they were beaten and enslaved. And though she hated it with all her soul, she could not ignore that it shook her more than any blade ever had. The crowd began to shift, their voices rising higher, some chanting for blood, some whispering that this human might be more than he seemed. And the sound grew louder until it was no longer whispers but waves crashing against the walls of the arena. And for the first time in generations, the creatures of the empire spoke not in blind obedience, but in doubt and wonder, and that sound filled the queen with rage greater than any she had ever known. She lashed her tail, trying to throw him off, but he only pulled harder, his hands slick with sweat and blood, yet his grip unbroken. And his voice rose again, stronger, this time as he shouted that humans would not kneel forever, that the chains would one day break, that fear itself could not hold them down. And his words echoed against the stone until even the air seemed to tremble with them. The queen stepped closer, her shadow falling over him, her eyes blazing with hatred and shame, and her voice promised him death slow and cruel beyond imagination. But still he did not release, still he did not kneel, and in that endless moment, the arena itself felt caught between two worlds, one of chains and fear, and another of fire and freedom, and no creature could look away. And so the queen raised her claw again. Higher than before, her fury gathered like a storm ready to strike and end this defiance once and for all. But in her chest, she felt something strange, something sharp, something that twisted like a thorn of doubt, and though she swore she would destroy him, she could not silence the fear that if she failed, the empire itself would never be the same. The sky above the arena had turned darker, as if even the sun was hiding from the storm that was unfolding below, and the drums that once beat in rhythm had fallen silent, as if the empire itself held its breath, waiting for what would happen next, because in the center of the arena stood a fragile human with his hand locked around the tail of the queen, and in front of him towered the ruler of the empire, her claws raised high, her wings stretched wide, her fury shaking the air like thunder, yet still she had not struck the final blow. The crowd was restless, their whispers rising like the hiss of fire spreading across dry wood. Some shouted for the queen to end it, now others whispered that the human had already won something far greater than survival, because he had forced their ruler to hesitate, and that hesitation was more shocking than any act of violence they had ever seen. And the whispers grew into shouts until the entire arena sounded like a storm trapped inside stone walls. Guards stood frozen at their posts, their spears glowing faintly with the strange blue light of the empire, their orders still clear to act only on command, and yet even they could not stop their eyes from flickering toward the human who stood against their queen. And in their hearts, a question began to grow, though none dared to speak it aloud. What if he was right? What if humans were not weak? What if chains could be broken? The queen lowered her claw for a moment, not out of mercy, but out of something far more dangerous, curiosity. She had seen thousands of slaves crawl before her. She had seen warriors fall and rulers beg for mercy, and she had crushed them all without thought or pause. Yet this human had not begged, had not crawled, had not broken, and his grip on her tail felt like an insult that pierced her pride deeper than any blade, and she wanted to understand what gave him such fire. Even as her rage told her only to kill him, the human felt his body shaking, every muscle burning, every breath tearing his chest apart. Yet he refused to release his grip, because he knew this was more than his life. It was the moment. Every human in chains dreamed of the moment when fear itself could be broken, and though his legs trembled, though his arms screamed with pain, he pulled tighter and raised his voice, so all could hear, telling them that humans were not made to kneel forever, telling them that their strength was not in claws or wings, but in their will that no empire could crush forever. His words echoed across the arena, carried by the stones themselves, and the crowd that had come to laugh at his death now listened in silence, as if the world itself had shifted under their feet, and the aliens who had always looked upon humans as little more than shadows began to feel something strange in their chests, something heavy and powerful, something that felt like respect. The queen felt this shift too, and it burned her more than fire, because she could feel the eyes of her people not on her, but on him, and their silence was not worship, it was doubt, and that doubt was poison to the throne she had ruled for centuries, and she could not allow it to live yet. Even as her fury roared inside her heart, a shadow of fear crept into her thoughts. For the first time in her reign, she lashed out again, her claw cutting through the air, but the human twisted his body just enough to escape, and the strike shattered stone where he had stood, sending shards flying across the arena. But still he was alive, still he was gripping her tail, and the sound of gasps rose like a wave across the crowd, because this fragile human had now survived 2 killing strikes from the queen, and still he stood unbroken. Queen screamed, her wings beating the air so hard the dust lifted into a storm around them, and she slammed her tail to the ground, trying to throw him off. But he clung tighter, his body battered, his face covered in sweat and blood. Yet his grip stronger than ever, and his voice rose again, telling her that fear was ending, telling her that one day her throne would fall not by weapons, but by the will of those she thought beneath her. And the crowd trembled as his words dug into their hearts. The guards exchanged uneasy glances, their grips on their spears uncertain, because they could see what was happening before them, and they knew that if the Queen lost even for a moment, it would change everything, and their fear was no longer of the human, but of the world that would come after this moment. And still they waited, because only the Queen could decide what would come next. She stood now face to face with him, her eyes burning with hatred and shame, and her voice a whisper sharp as a blade. She promised that she would tear him apart piece by piece, and show his broken body to every human in the Empire, as proof that resistance was useless. But even as she spoke the words, she could not hide the tremor in her tone, the first fracture in her perfect mask of power. The human saw it, and he knew that this was the moment, the breaking point, when fear turned against itself, when the cracks in the throne began to spread. And though he could barely stand, though his body was close to collapsing, he pulled once more on her tail with every last drop of strength inside him, and the unthinkable happened. The Queen stumbled just one step forward, her balance broken, and the sound of the crowd gasping was louder than thunder. For the first time in living memory, the alien Queen had faltered before a human, and though she quickly steadied herself, the damage was done. The image of her perfection, the illusion of her invincibility, had shattered before thousands of eyes, and nothing she could do would erase that moment. And the whispers of the crowd grew into shouts, and the shouts grew into a roar that shook the very walls of the arena. And as the sound filled the sky, the Queen raised her claw once more, preparing for one final strike that would either destroy him or destroy her throne forever. The Queen towered over the human, her wings stretched wide, her claw raised high, and the entire arena seemed to vanish into silence as every eye fixed upon her, and every heart beat as one, because they knew this strike would decide more than the life of the fragile figure below. It would decide the meaning of fear itself. And the human stood trembling, his body broken, his chest rising and falling like a storm trapped inside his ribs, yet his hand never released her tail, and his eyes never looked away from hers. And in that stare there was no weakness, only fire. The claw came down like lightning, splitting the air with its force, but in that instant the human pulled with all the strength left inside him, his grip tearing at her scales, his muscles screaming with pain. And the impossible happened. The Queen stumbled again, her balance thrown off by the force of his defiance, and her claw struck the ground beside him. Instead of tearing him apart, the stone shattered, the dust rose into the sky, but the human still stood, still alive, still holding her tail. The crowd erupted in gasps and cries, some screaming in disbelief, others roaring in wild voices, because what they had seen was something they thought could never be imagined. A human forcing the Queen herself to falter not once, but twice. And though their voices were many, their hearts were one, because in that moment they all knew the truth, that the Queen was not untouchable, and that her rule was not unbreakable, and that truth spread like fire through every corner of the arena. The Queen's eyes burned with a rage deeper than the abyss, her pride wounded, her throne shaken, her soul screaming with humiliation. She wanted to kill him more than she had ever wanted anything in her long reign. Yet even as she raised her claw again, even as her wings thundered against the air, she could feel the poison of doubt crawling through her chest, because she knew every creature watching would never forget what they had seen, and no matter what she did, this moment would live forever. The human spoke again, his voice raw but strong enough to cut through the roar of the crowd. He shouted that humans were not slaves, that chains could be broken, that fear could be defeated. He shouted that she could strike him down, and still his spirit would not bow. And the crowd listened to every word like it was the beating of their own hearts, and the sound of his voice carried farther than her roar, because it was the sound of truth. The guards stood frozen, their spears still glowing, yet their hands trembling because they knew their queen demanded loyalty. But their eyes had seen her stumble, and their ears had heard the words of the human, and they could no longer silence the doubt inside them. And though none dared to move, none dared to act. Their silence itself was betrayal, because silence was the seed of rebellion. Queen struck again with fury enough to shake the walls, but the human moved just enough to survive her blow, and again he pulled at her tail with desperate force, and again she lost her balance, and this time her knee struck the ground, sending a shiver through the arena because the impossible had happened. The alien queen, the ruler of the empire, the shadow that had held millions in chains, was brought to her knees by a single human. Crowd erupted with a sound that was not fear, but something far stronger, something dangerous. It was awe and respect and even hope, and their voices rose in a storm louder than the queen's roar, and the sound cut through her pride like a blade, because she knew this moment would never be erased. No matter how much blood was spilled, she glared at him, her chest heaving, her fury drowning her pride, her claws still sharp enough to tear him apart. And yet she could not strike, because if she killed him, now the crowd would not see her strength. They would only see her fear, and if she let him live, then her humiliation would grow into rebellion. She was trapped between death and disgrace, and for the first time in her reign, she could not find the path that restored her throne. The human felt his body failing, every bone aching, every breath like fire, yet he did not let go. He used the last of his strength to hold her down, and he whispered, though his voice shook, that fear ends here. And though only she heard it, the words burned into her soul because she knew they were true. The arena was alive with the roar of thousands, voices chanting words that shook the ground. Some cried for her to kill him, others cried for her to fall, but all of them were united in one truth. The human had broken the illusion of her perfection, and nothing could change that. And as she looked into his eyes, she saw not just him, but every human she had chained, every spirit she had tried to break, and she felt for the first time in her life the weight of her own fear. Slowly, the queen pulled back her wings, folding against her body, her claws lowering, not in mercy, but in silent admission that this battle was lost, and she tore her tail from his grip, stepping back, her eyes still burning with hatred, but also with something she could never erase, humiliation. And as she turned her back to retreat, the crowd gasped louder than ever, because never in all their lives had they seen their queen step back from any creature, and yet here she was stepping away from a human. The human fell to his knees, not in surrender, but in exhaustion. His strength gone, his body broken, yet his spirit still blazing like fire. And the crowd stared at him with eyes that no longer saw a slave, no longer saw weakness, but saw defiance, saw strength, saw hope. And in that moment, the chains in their hearts began to break. The queen returned to her throne, her silence heavier than her roar, her wings wrapped around her body like a shield against the eyes of her people. But the damage was done. The image of her perfection shattered, the seeds of rebellion planted, the empire forever changed. And though she still lived, though she still ruled, she could never erase the moment a human seized her tail and forced her to her knees. And so the story of the arena ended, not with death, not with mercy, but with truth. And that truth spread far beyond the walls, carried in whispers and in fire. And every human who heard it felt their chains grow lighter, and every alien who heard it felt their fear of the queen grow smaller. And though the empire still stood, its foundation had cracked because one human had dared to hold on, and that was the end of fear, the end